Welcome everyone. So for this first video, I thought I would start with some of the common problems that I've noticed while tutoring over the past couple years, people first learning JavaScript, React, things like that. And one of the biggest problems that I've noticed consistently is understanding functions. So what we're actually going to do is use codepen.io because everybody can access this no matter where you are, no matter what kind of computer you have, and you don't even need an account. We can just come over here and click start coding. But if you want to save your work, create an account, and I'm actually going to set this up so that the editing is on the left side, and this is all going to be in JavaScript. And then you can see down here in the bottom left, we have the console. Now, what CodePen does is automatically compiles all of your code every time that you type something in, so it'll automatically keep on updating. So yeah, if you have something and it's incomplete and you don't type for a couple seconds, it'll automatically throw an error. So just to not have to deal with that for now, we're going to keep the console closed while we work through this. Now, in talking about functions, there's an important concept to clear up, and that is understanding variables and naming and how things point to each other in JavaScript. So the reason for this is one of the big confusions that I've noticed is the idea of variables, or substitution as I would call it. So if you create a constant variable, we'll just use let for now because they're easier. Let's just say first name equal Steven. Okay. JavaScript has no concerns with what this is. It's just a sequence of letters that create some kind of value in the system, and then it knows whenever it sees first name somewhere, it's going to substitute that with the string Steven. Everything that's named, every kind of variable, every kind of function works exactly the same way. So if instead of having this, I had a function named first name, okay, it would pull up the function instead of a string. That's a name. Think of this in terms of dog training. When you're training a dog, different commands, whether it be its name, sit, heel, anything like that, the dog doesn't actually have any sense of what that word is or what it means. The dog doesn't understand the word sit. What the dog understands is cause and effect. So you have a treat in the hand, the dog wants it. You tell it to sit, and then you do something to make it so that its butt is on the floor while it's upright. And then you give it the treat. You do that enough times, the dog makes the connection, right? So now it doesn't know that sit means sit. It knows that that word, if I do this, means good things. Likewise, JavaScript doesn't have any opinions about the names that you choose for your functions or your variables or what have you. It just knows that when it sees first name somewhere in the code, or whatever the name of your function is, go to that place. Do that thing, like a dog that's been trained with commands. And what I'd like to do is make this concept of substitution very, very clear. So let's imagine a function sit. Okay, and now let's break this down just a little bit. A function definition is comprised of the keyword function. What this does is, as your environment that's interpreting this code is reading through it line by line, it notices the keyword function and says, okay, after this, there needs to be a name, and then the parentheses we'll get into in a bit, but this creates basically a block of variables called parameters or arguments. And then the curly brackets create a code block. So basically, it says this is the name, so whenever I hear this name, go to this function. The parentheses is how we'll exchange things between outside the function and inside the function. We'll get to that in a second. And then the curly brackets afterwards create the code block. So one thing you might do as you're starting to learn is put them on their own line down here, so we know everything from here, this is the start, to here is what happens when this function is called. Now we'll borrow console log because it's just simple, and we'll say I sit. Or it's a dog, so they're excited. Okay. Now you will notice, and I just want to point this out because it's easy to overlook, console.log, right? .log is just a property in the console object, but it's also a function. The parentheses afterwards tells you this is executing a function, and what it simply does is it takes whatever you put in the parentheses and throws it in the console. So it's a very simple function, but it's extremely useful as well. Now, if we open the console, there'll be all kinds of errors here. We clear this up. We can actually execute from the console. This is the same thing as using a console in Google Chrome. And what we can do is we can call sit with the parentheses, and it executes the function. See, I sit. And since there's no return, it comes up undefined. We'll get into that in a minute. Now, up to this point, usually there's not too much confusion. But let's clear up a couple of things. One, this function is actually executing another function, so to some extent, it's superfluous. So let's try something a little bit different. Now, you noticed it came out as undefined. Let's actually see if we can get a return from that. So functions can have two possible outcomes. It can be void, which will come back undefined, that gives you back no actual value, or it can return a value of some kind. In this case, we're going to return a string, and then you'll see that undefined is no longer a thing. If I run sit now, we get back the string and no undefined. The reason this is different is this is not a console log, it's just spitting back what the function spits back. And the reason that this is appearing in the console in the first place is because I executed the function from the console command line. If I were to not return anything and just have an empty function sitting here, we could run it and you would see it just simply gives back undefined. The function exists and it runs, but since there's no actual code in here to run, it just says undefined. I don't know what's going on. Likewise, we could do something like 1 plus 2, which is a mathematical equation. This will run and it will know that 1 plus 2 is 3, but it won't actually spit it back until we say return 1 plus 2. And then if we come back down here, now we return 3, and you see it's no longer undefined. So the difference between having a return statement and not having a return statement in a function is what the function gives back to whatever is calling it. So consider this for a second. Return 1 plus 2, if we were to say let sum equal sit. Now sum is going to actually get a value here. Let me just clear this up. And if I were to check in the console, I can actually check the value of sum. It has 3. If I were to change this back to what we had before, what am I doing? There we go. And run that again, sum will now have the value of I sit. So here's what I'd like you to visualize. Anytime you see the word that is the name of a function and the parentheses afterwards, this is actually a placeholder for whatever's going to come back from the return statement. So you could have a lot of complicated things happening in a function, and ultimately if you run the function and then assign its value to another variable, what you're actually assigning to that variable is what the function returns. And so this is one of the things that I think is really worth understanding, because let's say we were to change this to no parentheses, just sit. Now what are we doing? Instead of executing the function and giving this variable whatever the value of this return statement is, we're actually just giving it the value of the function itself. So now if I were to come in here and check the value of sum, it's the whole function. And this relates back to what I was saying earlier about anytime you see this structure, this syntax of letters and then parentheses, always try to think of that as this is a function that's being run. Now, let's address something a little bit more technical here. And we're going to keep the function simple, but the concept is slightly more complicated than what we've been doing here. So let's imagine we have a function sum, which we were dealing with just a minute ago, and we'll just set it up in one habit I'd like you to get into. Every time you're writing a function, and I'm putting this on the new line, normally this is how I write them, but if it's easier for you to visualize it this way, use that. So I mentioned earlier arguments and parameters. They're both basically defining the same thing. It's just a different side of the equation, so to speak. So let's say we have some x and y, or a and b, or whatever. Basically, we're having two numbers. This is getting back into high school algebra. It should be somewhat familiar to you. But the basic concept is sum is going to add two numbers, and return the result of adding them together. Now, we don't know what those numbers are going to be. To some extent, okay, these are your arguments, is what this is going to be. Oops. Let's undo that. This is somewhat similar to creating variables x and y. This is one of the reasons I tend to avoid the language of parameters and arguments and all that stuff, because it gets a little silly. And we'll set up the simple return statement here. It's just going to be return x plus y. That's all we're going to do for this function, because this is to visualize something else. When we go to execute this function, let's say we come into the console here and we do sum, we're not going to get anything. NaN is not a number, because what it actually tried to do is add undefined and undefined, and I can show you that right here. Not a number. Okay? If we don't assign any values to x and or y, they automatically default to undefined. Everything that's not defined is undefined. Makes sense, right? The way to get something assigned to x and y is when we invoke the function, when we execute, we say sum, we give one number, and then a second number, for instance, for example. And what is effectively doing? And the way to visualize this, so right, these are the parameters when you execute, and then within the function they become arguments, and this is why I avoid this language, because it gets a little silly. Think about it this way. X and Y are variable names. We could almost say let x equal x. I mean, we could actually literally do this. Let y equal y. Okay? This is an extra step that we don't need. But effectively, when you have the function definition, function name, and then the parameters, we're saying we're creating a variable that's local to the function named x, and then another one named y. And you can have as many of these as you want separated by commas. When we call the function down here, when we execute, whatever the order is of the variables inside these parentheses is the order that our values in this function execution are going to be assigned. So 2 gets assigned to x, 3 gets assigned to y. So this is effectively saying let x equal 2, let y equal 3. And then within the scope of this function, it's going to run as if that is the case. And I can show you that right here instead of having it in line. We'll do sum 2, 3. Same exact thing here, okay? And it returns 5, which 2 plus 3 is in fact 5. Now here's something important to note. JavaScript, especially in a case like this, where we don't have a specific kind of variable declared, right? It just knows that there's something coming in, I'm going to name it x, and there's something coming in, I'm going to name it y. I don't know what it is. It's agnostic about what it is. So interestingly, we could actually say sum, and we can say a string. First one is I, and then the second one we can put a space and say sit. And what it's going to do is actually combine two strings into a single string and then spit back the combined strings. So in a case like this, if you wanted to make sure that you were only adding numbers and returning numbers, you might come in here and do something like an if statement, and then we'll create the code block. We'll put our return inside the code block, so it will only execute if we have the types that we're willing to add. And then we might say if type of x equals number, and I'm not going to get into this too much. You know, we can do this in another video if we need to. And type of y is a number. And then we'll just throw a quick else on here, and we'll say console log wrong input type. So then we can see if we try to do something like I just did before, it should say wrong input type, give us undefined, because the function didn't actually return anything. If we do the numbers again, we get back 5. So to wrap up really quickly, I just want to reiterate this. When we're creating the function, we start with function, and then we give it a name, parentheses, and curly brackets, and this is where the code is going to go, inside the curly brackets. Code goes here. When we call the function, we type the name and the parentheses. If you try to call the function without using the parentheses, you're actually going to create a reference to the function itself. This is just, name is just everything after the E. So the parentheses and the curly brackets. Name with the parentheses is actually calling the function, and it's gonna replace this placeholder with whatever the function returns, in addition to doing whatever the function does. There may be several instructions inside the function that can alter other things. In general, you don't want to do that. That's called side effects. You're going to be strongly advised against that. So I hope that helped. Leave any questions in the comments below, and you guys have a good one.